So this is the third and final of the basic videos for assignment 2, which is just combining your images in Photoshop. So I have now exported a rendered pass, a line work pass, and not that one. That's actually a final image. Let's open the correct one, which I'm just going to drag into Photoshop. There it is. So this was my color ambient occlusion pass. So these three images here. As part of your final submission, I would like you guys to submit each of these as part of a single combined PDF, where the first image in your PDF is the final combined image that has all the layers as one, and then each layer as a separate layer, as a separate page as part of that multi-page PDF. That way we can see that you've done all the layers and you have combined them. So what I'm going to do is actually just take each of these layers. So I'm going to take my shadows here and I'm just going to drag it into the next file and just use they're the same size, so they should just snap to alignment in the center here, where you can see the purplish pinkish lines showing the axes are aligned. I'm going to do the same thing with my line work. Just dragging it in. And now I'm going to use one of the simplest and easiest commands, which is over here under layers. You have your layer type, which is currently set to normal. I'm going to open it up and set it to multiply. Essentially what that does is any layer that's set to multiply essentially sets the opacity of that layer based on how white it is. Anything that is white is 100% opaque. Anything that is black is 100%, anything that's white is 100% transparent. Anything that's black is 100% opaque, which means it's very useful for applying black and white images, such as shadows and lines, onto other images. Because essentially the only thing that appears is the tone or darkness of the image. So the shadows instantly kind of appear, and the line work instantly appears. Now, by itself, this does not make a very compelling image. It's too dark. The lines are too heavy. So you want to adjust the opacity of each of these layers. So I'm going to take the opacity of the line work layer down and the opacity of the shadows so that I can lighten up the image. I want the shadows to be there, but I don't want them to be quite as domineering as we just saw. So already taking this down to looks like 34%. You can see the difference turning that layer on and off, and just how much adding some shadows really helps. Same thing for the lines. All of a sudden it gives a bit more identity to the objects and the whole composition. Between those two things, the image is 10 times better already. And that's why it's really useful to export these things separately. From Rhino, we could set up so this is the Arctic view. We could give this some lines by itself. Display mode, open that up, and let's see, we could go down to surface edge settings, set that to 1, and set the color reduction to 100, and we get a similar looking image. This is great for standard exports, but if we're trying to make a nicer looking image, this alone probably doesn't give us quite the degree of control we want. By adding these layers separately in Photoshop, we can get exactly how much lines we want in the image, from 0 to 100% lines, which again, 50 seem to be pretty close to a nice number. Just kind of move these toggles around until they seem nice to you. Same thing for the shadows. We could have 100% shadows, which is kind of dark and depressing maybe, or 30%, which gives you a sense of the shadows but isn't quite as intense. The next is, so down here in the bottom right-hand corner, we have this little circle that's halfway filled. If I click on that, I'm getting a whole bunch of different layer adjustments. So I'm going to go over all of these multiple times throughout the course of this semester, but I'm going to go to my favorite one first, which is the curves adjustment. This is very likely, possibly the most powerful adjustment amongst all of these. What it's going to give you is something that looks awfully like this, which is a little diagonal line that goes across let's really call it a histogram. And then you have a choice of adjusting RGB, red, green, and blue. Essentially the different channels of the colors that make up every image that you see. This line essentially is anything that you make an adjustment on the lower left-hand side here, adjust the dark tones of your scene. Anything you make an adjustment in the upper right-hand corner is the light tones of the scene. And basically it just goes between the two. So if I pull this corner up, but leave everything else the same, I am lightening, oops, you can see it gets a little crazy if you had too many points, but I am lightening the lightest part of the scene while leaving everything else the same, but it's trying to connect the curve, so it actually is making things a little bit darker. Whereas if I pull this down, if I make a curve that looks like this, I'm essentially making my darks darker and my lights lighter, which is the same thing as adding contrast to an image. If I do the opposite, I'm actually flattening the image. So I'm making my lights darker and my darks lighter, which makes for a really uncompelling, not great looking image. You don't necessarily want to over exaggerate the contrast here. It's something you want to play with a bit. So the next is maybe we get this to adjust a little bit, and maybe we find an area that we're happy with the sort of contrast we're getting out of it. Is I'm going to do the same thing with each channel of red, green, and blue. Now, if you've ever used Instagram filters, this is essentially all Instagram filters are curves adjustments. So if I adjust the reds, in this case, I'm going to pull the reds out of on the lower left-hand corner, which are the shadows, and bring them back in on the highlights. I'm essentially making the darker areas of my scene less red and the brighter areas of my scene more red. It's starting to look a little bit weird, but let's keep going down onto green. I might do about the opposite. Or maybe I'll do the same thing. Again, it gets real weird if you add 3 points in. And blue. So I'm going to make my shadows more blue. And essentially you start to get this sort of really contrasty Instagram filter looking thing. I would probably never recommend going this extreme with any sort of filtering that you're doing. However, a little bit of an adjustment, maybe something a little bit more subtle than this, can help improve the sort of quality and coloring of an image without having to make huge adjustments. So maybe it's something like, yeah, maybe I'm happy with that. And then we can, of course, turn that layer off and on, and we can see what the effect is. It seems like it's making it much more green, so maybe I'll turn that down a bit. But again, whenever you're creating renderings and images, this acts on as an example, but perspectives, anything. To me, a curves adjustment is always one of the most powerful things that you should always have is the top layer in your layer stack in Photoshop, because it affects everything below it and is a great way to start unifying the colors of your different things that you're adding together. In this case, I'm only adding like images to one another, so it's really not having as big of an impact. But it's a really good adjustment that I think you should all do as a final adjustment layer to your image. There are, of course, some others in here, this hue and saturation, which I could make the image black and white if I wanted to, or oversaturate it like crazy, lighten and darken it. I'm just gonna turn that off. Could do brightness and contrast, up the contrast, which is the same thing as that curve adjustment I just did, which is why curves are more powerful, or up the brightness. And let's see what else we have here. Black and white, we'll just do exactly what it says. Levels are another really powerful and important one, but they're not going to really show up very well as an adjustment right here. So I will talk about them at a later time. But all of these edits also can be found up here under image adjustments. However, there's one big difference between doing it in the lower right-hand corner as a layer and doing it in the upper left-hand corner as an image adjustment. Anything you do here is permanent. As soon as you save this file, that change has been saved to the image forever and cannot be undone. Anything that you do down here as a layer adjustment, this is a temporary change that will be saved with the file and can be undone infinitely. I'm a big advocate in Photoshop of what's called non-destructive editing, which is to say anything you do in Photoshop should be able to be undone the next day. You should be able to go to sleep, think about your file, wake up the next day, realize you made a huge mistake, and completely undo what you did. This is not only crucial for Studio, but it is an absolute must for working professionally. I can't tell you how many times a client one day told me, oh, I really want to see something in Photoshop. Maybe it was they wanted to see a particular plant in front of their house or building or something. And I spent all this time rendering in plants exactly the way they wanted. And the next day they're like, never mind. It's incredibly helpful if I can just immediately turn off those layers and undo those changes, as opposed to doing them destructively where I would have to start from scratch if I had made those layer adjustments permanent. The big disadvantage of doing it this way, though, is this does increase your file size. So I have had Photoshop files be multiple gigabytes of data, which does take up a lot of space and can be problematic. I have heard of some firms actually getting angry at students when they were doing this practice because it was taking up too much space on the server. But realistically, they probably should just get a bigger server and not deal with the fact that later on their client may change their mind. That's more important to me, and that's more time consuming and more costly than buying a few extra gigabytes for your server. Anyways, rant over. So that's the Photoshop layer adjustment. Essentially, once you've done this, you will just save this as, I'd save it as a Photoshop file. Even though I import it as a TIFF, TIFFs can maintain all of the layers. As you see here, there's a little toggle that says layers. As a general rule of thumb, I'm always going to try to save things as a Photoshop file. The reason being, later on, when I'm looking back and trying to figure out which file I messed with, which was my final file that had all of my beautiful rendering in it, I need to make sure that I know which one it is, and I will look for Photoshop files. TIFF files I will have dozens of because anything I exported was going to be a TIFF. So using Photoshop or PSD is a great way to keep yourself organized. Again, there's not really a disadvantage of saving as a TIFF with layers on, but for organization, always save as a PSD or Photoshop file. But I probably will want to export a JPEG, just save as a JPEG and such. I'll probably want to do the same thing for each of these layers. So this TIFF layer, I want to save as a JPEG. The line layer, I want to save as a JPEG. And I guess the initial pass, the Arctic with color, I want to save a JPEG. Combine them all into a single PDF, and that will be my final submission for the semester. Or not semester, for the assignment. All right, that's it for this. Again, I will probably do another more advanced video later in the week that covers more advanced modeling techniques that you may want to use for your project. All right, thank you guys.